Presbyterians are known for thinking deep thoughts about God, the Jack Handys of the Christian faith. The chief end of man, those 17th century Westminster Christians wrote, is to glorify God and enjoy God forever. Ever since that time, we've been pretty accomplished at glorifying God, but we could use some help on the enjoyment side. How does Mary get there? How does she find and sustain so much joy? Clearly, it's not from the present circumstances. Her fiancé comes close to dismissing her in shame, poor, unwed, teenage mother. How does she find so much joy? One thing that is clear, she doesn't find that joy all by herself. Mary finds it with her cousin, Elizabeth. The first clue to finding joy when circumstances point in the opposite direction. Maybe she goes to Elizabeth's house because she knows that Elizabeth too is pregnant, though the text isn't clear at that point on who knows what. But that shared experience leads to a second observation about where to find joy when you can't find it in the circumstances alone. Sometimes you need to be with somebody who knows what you're going through. Grieving at Christmas, sometimes you need to be around others who have done the same. Caring for an ailing spouse, struggling to find your footing after graduation from high school or college. It is helpful to be around others who have been through something similar. It's why our church has to keep expanding our diversity of all kinds. Sometimes you just need to be with people who share your type of experience, because the experience of being known can lead to a kind of joy even when the experience itself is painful. It's the secret sauce to Alcoholics Anonymous and so many other groups like it. Mary's fiancé, Joseph, or Elizabeth's husband, Zechariah, could be the most supportive spouses on the planet, but they'll never know what it feels like to go through what Mary and what Elizabeth are going through. When you're going through something, surrounding yourself with people who know what you're going through increases the possibility of joy. Yet visiting Elizabeth is a kind of risky decision, if you ask me. She's elderly. The text tries to be as polite as possible, describing her and her husband as getting on in years. They're old people. But not only that, the text says they are righteous people, living blamelessly according to all the commandments and regulations of the Lord. Now, I know that I have never been a teenage girl before, but I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that if I was in Mary's situation, not yet married, in a culture concerned about pregnancy outside of marriage, and I suddenly became pregnant, I'm probably not going to make my first visit to an older, married cousin who everybody describes as blameless before the Lord, not in this situation. The relationship between Elizabeth and Mary leads to a third observation about where to find joy when you can't find it in the circumstances around us. Neither Mary nor Elizabeth judges the experience of the other. Both adopt postures of curiosity. Mary doesn't expect Elizabeth to meet her with condemnation or judgment just because she's older, with a conventional, traditional lifestyle, habit, and faith. Elizabeth, when learning of Mary's pregnancy, is open to the joy that the Holy Spirit gives to her in the moment, against what some might see as the conventional guidance of her faith. And this very human posture of curiosity is actually a spiritual one, because the openness to possibility is what leads them both to an understanding of what new thing God is doing in and through them. if you can't be open to the different experiences of others, you will have a harder time staying open to what new thing God may be doing in the world. In fact, a closed posture is why Zechariah, the priest, who is the husband of Elizabeth and the one everyone expects to be the most spiritual, is silenced by God for the duration of his wife's pregnancy. He wasn't curious about what new thing God might be doing. He wasn't open to the ways that God might be working in his own time and his own place. He had become used to explaining the limits of God's power and activity as the expert in his field. God doesn't like to be mansplained. Actually, no one does. So the angel shuts him down. And this is where relying too much on knowledge about God can get even the smartest of people into trouble. Knowledge becomes a tool to box in God and elevate our sophistication about God instead. A tool to center individuals in the story when, as Elizabeth and Mary know firsthand, God is always the primary actor when it comes to overthrowing oppression, saving people whose backs are against the wall, setting things right, making things new. When you remember this, you remember to look for God constantly. And when you're looking for God constantly, you're able to see the countless ways that God is working all around you, which adds to the possibility of joy. People who are curious about themselves, others, and the world, they are some of the most joyful people around. That openness to the Holy Spirit, that openness to the experience of God in the present moment is what leads Elizabeth to give Mary the Hail Mary blessing for the Catholics among us, you who probably know the prayer but may not realize where it came from. Blessed are you among women, blessed is the fruit of your womb, blessed is she who believed there would be a fulfillment of what was spoken to her by the Lord. And that is the fourth way that I see the pathway to joy, receiving a blessing when you really need it. We can be stingy with our blessings, which can have a profound effect. In fact, if we shared our most painful experiences with each other this morning, don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to do it. I bet that 75 to 80% of them would be related to early childhood memories of parents withholding blessing. Children who didn't get the clear message that their parents loved them unconditionally. Children who didn't get a clear message that a parent was proud of them simply for who they were. Jesus will ask the question later in Matthew's gospel, is there anyone among you who, if your child asked for bread, would give a stone? Or if a child asked for a fish, would give a snake? My experience from listening to a lot of pain is that metaphorically the answer seems to be yes. There are a lot of people who didn't get the bread and the fish they asked for. They got stones and snakes instead. And the cycle of stone and snake giving tends to continue over generations. Parenting turned into a kind of fraternity rush over the generations. We learn to be stingy with our blessings. This is contrary to the nature of God, who doles out blessing with abandon. In fact, one of the biggest bones to pick with God by people of faith in our tradition is that God seems to be more reckless with blessings than righteous people think is healthy or wise. Elizabeth, a more experienced woman from an older generation, gives her blessing. Imagine how that feels to Mary. Mary, who may wonder if her fiancé might leave her, her parents disown her, her family desert her, her friends abandon her, want to experience joy when circumstances don't lend themselves to it. Find a blessing. Want to reflect God to another person? Give bread instead of stones. Give fish instead of snakes. Blessings are what God is all about. I think Mary knows this, which is the fifth and final way I see finding joy when you're not finding it in the circumstances around you. It is knowing the whole story of God's work in the past so that you can trust God's promises for the future. Mary's song, after all, isn't really a song about herself. And it is not particularly original. It sounds a lot like Hannah's song, an earlier woman of faith who also praised God for doing what others said would be impossible in her life. And that song sounds a lot like other songs of other faithful women in the past, including the hymn of Miriam, celebrating the liberation of the Jewish people from slavery, which some scholars believe may be the earliest Hebrew writing in the Hebrew Scriptures. All of these songs are what Walter Brueggemann calls lyrics of abundance. Songs that celebrate God's extraordinary generosity in a world that is constantly spreading the myth of scarcity. A myth of scarcity, Brueggemann writes, will never generate bread for the world, but only bread for us and ours. The lyric of abundance asserts that in the hand of the generative, generous God, scarcity is not true. And yet we know that that myth of scarcity, it has a lot of staying power. You saw it in some of the reactions to the build action on Monday night. We don't have enough money to rebuild our neighborhoods, even when the data itself says otherwise. You hear it in some of the language about the war in Gaza and the attacks on Israel, that there's not enough land or enough goodwill for peace for everyone. Only security at the expense of the other. You see it in the winner-take-all politics that is crippling our country and making it difficult for some of us to even have holiday gatherings or constructive conversations that acknowledge there's more than a single narrative about what is going on in the world. You know, I learned this week at our Theology on Tap gathering that there was almost a bar fight last month when one person tried to assert a single narrative that everyone else had to get behind to be good or righteous. Unfortunately, participants in the gathering itself made it clear that single narratives are not the way we treat difference in our community. Mary knows that her Jewish tradition is marked by the God of abundance, who gifts a people with life, land, and covenant that they are to steward toward even more abundance than they can imagine. Abundance that can bless everyone if stewarded according to God's ways of justice. And she applies that faith story to her own in this miraculous birth. But really, that faith story could be applied to each and every one of our lives. Life and love have been gifted to each of us by God. And when we steward our lives as the gifts that we are intended to be to the world, abundance, it abounds. And no, the abundance that has been promised doesn't mean you can do whatever you want whenever you want to do it. That's a distortion of what abundance means. God's abundance means there is enough for everyone to receive and experience the joy that God desires for everyone. It just means there is enough. And whenever the world isn't reflecting that abundance, God is at work to overthrow whatever persons, systems, or states of mind that are preventing that world of blessing of becoming real for everyone. When you know the truth of that story, and you know God's determination behind it, you can weather most any storm, holding fast to the promises that God has made to a people, to you and to me. The church takes its cues from Mary. We organize ourselves to find joy together, not all alone. We stretch to become more diverse than we are, increasing the chances that whatever you experience, there's somebody here who's been through something similar. We strive not to judge the difference of experiences, but to cherish those differences as the pathway to a greater appreciation of the magnificent mystery of God. Generational divides become generational support. We make blessing, not judgment, our first instinct, and we sing the lyrics of abundance, peppered all through the stories of our ancestors in the faith. We need all of these habits, these ways of being in the new year, as we cannot count on circumstances to bring us hope, peace, or joy. But with Mary as our guide, we see too that we don't have to wait for joy. It's here already. In relationships that sustain us, in the stories that guide us, the God who loves us and loves our world enough to already be at work, turning the world upside down.